It is one thing if you believe in something which doesn't happen in your lifetime. But what if that belief, that ideal, becomes real in your lifetime and you see the skeletons in it, you see the mud marks in it. And this conflicted Milton, this disillusioned Milton, this Milton who questions not just his blindness, but the very purpose of life of a blind man, this Milton is the Milton who wrote Paradise Lost. Not when he was in the peak of his political glory, but rather when he was practically in hiding. Hello and welcome to Nibblepop. We are doing this series on history of English literature, and this video is going to be on the Puritan age or the age of John Milton. If you are studying in any undergraduate or postgraduate course in English in any university across the world, no matter which text you are supposed to study, it is very useful to know about the different stages or literary periods in the history of English literature. Sometimes history becomes boring, doesn't it? But when you look at the men behind the works, the real stories behind the stories you read, you will see another fascinating narrative unfolding. This narrative is the history behind the books that you will read, behind the works that you will study. So don't miss any video in this series. Subscribe to my channel to get regular updates on all our videos and keep suggesting the topics which you want me to cover. This is Monami Mukherjee. Welcome once again. In some of the previous videos, we have seen how the Renaissance flourished in England and how the political scenario was getting stabilized. Today we will see how after Queen Elizabeth, there was a gradual destabilization of this political structure and how that impacted literature of the period. As a queen, Elizabeth was a very good politician and a very balanced person. But the two people who succeeded her, first James I and then his son Charles I, they lacked the political flexibility of Elizabeth. Two things were happening during the reign of James I. Number one, the power of the parliament was rising, and number two, commercial classes with Puritan sentiments, they were gaining power. Now, although in a monarchy you might feel that the king has absolute power or the queen has absolute power, there is also a very important role which the parliament plays, especially roles related to the kind of money a king has in his disposal, the kind of soldiers he is allowed to have, the kind of wars he is allowed to wage against other nations. So these are the things in which the parliament takes active decision. And with James I's reign, this decision-making power of the parliament was increasing. Now with Charles I, the problem magnified. Now King Charles was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. Divine right in the sense that the king is God's representative on earth. So he has kind of absolute authority on everybody, absolute power, and he cannot be challenged by anyone. It was during his time that a war broke out between these Protestants or the Puritans and the Catholics. What was the stand of King Charles at this point? You see, Charles was married to a French woman named Henrietta Maria, who was a staunch Catholic. Another important figure in his life was the person, Duke of Buckingham. In fact, he became the Duke of Buckingham during Charles I's reign. He made him the Duke of Buckingham and they were very close friends. It was during this time that England went into war against Spain on one hand and France on the other. And whenever there is a war, that the government needs more and more money, especially to recruit soldiers, to feed them, to support them and stuff. And that is why Charles needed more money. And who was the money sanctioning authority? The Parliament. So the Parliament was approached by Charles, and the Parliament was not very happy about the whole thing. They did not want so much expenditure on war. They did not want to raise the taxes of common people to provide for these wartime expenses of the king. And they played a trick. Parliament said, now this parliament, it consisted mostly or mainly of Puritan minded people, and they said that, okay, we are going to provide you with the kind of money you are asking for in exchange of something. You will be persecuting the Catholics, the Roman Catholics, and especially you will have to get rid of Duke of Buckingham. So they wanted more freedom for the Puritans, and in a way, this kind of was not acceptable to Charles, but he was in a fix here. Charles said that fine, I don't want the support of the Parliament. I will force my people, especially the Puritans, they were forced to pay up more money, in the form of some loan given to the government. So it was a kind of extortion from people, and it was kind of a military rule. People thought that Buckingham was behind all this. He was controlling the king and making him extort money from people. And so they eventually murdered Buckingham. This angered the king very much. He was sad because his friend was dead, and at the same time, he was now dead against the parliamentarians, he was dead against the Puritans. He wanted revenge. But on the other hand, the parliament supporters, uh, they were gaining strength, and the parliament was getting stronger in turn. There was a violent incident, and Charles decided to carry on without the parliament. And he continued for 11 years without summoning the parliament. He wanted to rule the country, almost like an anarchist. He wanted to be all powerful, and he felt that I don't need the parliament. But then from where was the money coming? Well, for one thing, he stopped the war with Spain and France. So if you don't have wars to fight, you need less money. Okay, so Charles made a compromise there. And he persuaded some parliamentary leaders to join his government. So he was playing all his cards. And in his court, which ran without the parliament's support, in his court, the Catholics, they gained power because it was obviously a strategy, a move against the Puritan minded people of the parliament. And when the whole system ran in such a way that the king took all the decisions without consulting with any parliament, without consulting with any other body of government, then obviously there is a pronounced tendency to interfere in all kinds of matter. Interference in especially commercial endeavors. Businessmen, they were angered that the government was deciding the terms and conditions. And there was a rising discontent because this was kind of tyranny, and this was not going with the spirit of this freedom-loving British people. And Charles was, well, he was forced to summon his parliament again after 11 years. This was the long parliament. It's called the long parliament, which sat for like 20 years and passed a lot of bills. There were very important bills that they passed. Some of them were like ministers and royal supporters like Archbishop Laud and Minister Strafford. They were sentenced, they were punished. The parliament passed a bill to take control of the military power, especially the train bands. Finally, they passed the bill to impeach the queen herself. Impeach means to bring to trial, that she will be judged for her influence, for her Catholic influence, for her destructive influence. And this angered Charles too much. He said, okay, I can't have this. So he couldn't take anymore. And he was so haughty, and he didn't know these tricks of politics. He didn't know how to make a compromise to settle matters. He believed in brute force, and he actually stormed the parliament with his personal swordsmen. Some 300, 400 swordsmen attacked the House of Parliament itself. It was something that was never done by any king before him. And this was something which really brought this war to the official front. Now the king was totally against the parliament. The queen was sent to Europe to gather soldiers, reinforcements. King Charles took his son, Charles II, and went to York to rule from there. He didn't feel safe in London. But on the other hand, the parliament had already had control of the train bands and they were gaining power. So this full-fledged civil war started. Now, there are different ways of looking at this civil war. It could be seen as a struggle between two religious sects or two kinds of believers like the Protestants and the Catholics. It could be seen as a democratic movement against one-party government. It was kind of a struggle of the middle class, a revolt of the middle class against the nobility. And it was also a kind of a fight between the town and the country. So there are different ways of looking at the civil war, but the implications were huge because, as we had seen in the case of the Wars of the Roses, a civil war, it splits families, it breaks down your center of belief, because it's not like a war with another nation where your nationalist spirit is fed with all these ideals. But this is a war in which you have to take sides, sometimes going against your family, sometimes going against your friends, and people begin to distrust each other. And this scenario is a very negative one. And therefore, civil wars have always disturbed not just the political scenario, but the cultural scenario of a nation. Now, while this was happening, deep within the heart of East Anglia, a Puritan spirit, a man, was gaining power, and this man was Oliver Cromwell. He soon became more and more powerful and eventually became a general, and he was an integral part of the parliamentarians. And he is considered to be the principal figure responsible for the fall of royalty or the fall of the royalists in the Civil War. Seeing that things were getting out of hand, King Charles, he made his wife and son escape, but he himself could not, escape eventual punishment. He was brought to London, put on trial, found guilty, and eventually executed by beheading. What kind of rule was there after Charles was gone? Apparently, people thought that now everything will be fine. But then, when one power is crushed by another, it is only the common man who suffers. The Puritan regime was far from the ideal one which people thought it will be. What kind of people were the Puritans? They were strict followers of moral codes. They did not believe in any kind of entertainment or amusement which is not related to man's duty to God. And therefore, once the Puritan regime started, theaters were closed. I have discussed that already in the video about the decadence of drama. The Puritans didn't believe in games and sports, so they closed down all these amusement centers, entertainment parks, and tried to impose the kind of belief that they believed in. Their language was language of the old-fashioned Bible texts. So people who had witnessed the flourishing of Renaissance, they couldn't identify with these kinds of dark and gloomy ethos, these dark dresses, these codes of morality that were imposed on them. And in the beginning, they made a compromise that, okay, it's better than a king who is forcing us to pay more taxes. This kind of rule is okay, but at one point, when these young men who were growing up during this time, they came of age, they started to get frustrated. Within a very short period of time, within a decade, this complete support started to wane off. People were sick and tired of these rules. Earlier, the church courts, they used to judge people for moral offenses. Now even the civil courts started to be controlled by these so-called saints or the Puritan people. And for offenses like, if a woman is convicted of being a witch, she would be condemned to death, sentenced to death. If somebody slept with another man's wife, that is adultery, then even there the punishment was death. Okay, these are offenses. At least the adultery is offense, fine. But you can't kill a man for that. You can't simply brand a woman a witch and kill her. That's murder. So these kinds of things were happening, and people were getting more and more disturbed by this whole idea of imposing a moral policing on their lives. And people said, give us our old Charles's life back. We want our king back. Oliver Cromwell, he had become the Lord Protector when this Puritan regime started. Although the popularity of the Puritan government was losing ground, and the Commonwealth, the idea of the Commonwealth was losing ground, but still, during the lifetime of Oliver Cromwell, he managed to remain in power and continue ruling, but he died at the age of 60. He was getting old too and tired. So according to the rules of Commonwealth, what should be the next step? To elect a ruler, conduct a full-fledged election, if you believe in democracy, because the Puritan regime was based on the idea of democracy as against monarchy. But what happened is that after the death of Oliver Cromwell, his son, Richard Cromwell, was made Lord Protector. So this was like, again, the son gets the throne. So where is any difference there? And the people of England, they thought that if you are reinstating monarchy in a way, kingship in a way, just the name is changed. You don't call him the king, you call him Lord Protector. And therefore, there was this mass agitation against this whole idea. And people really wanted the king back, because Charles II, who was growing up in France, and he had grown up to be a very charming man indeed. And somehow the people of England, they are fascinated by this idea of the blue blood. They always feel like no matter what these ideas of democracy is there in their minds, they always feel a kind of fascination towards the king's blood. And therefore, everybody wanted Charles II to return. Eventually, the rule of Richard Cromwell, a very short rule, ended, and Charles II was set on the throne of England in 1660. This is called the Restoration. Don't think that Charles II's rule was restored. No, he was never king before. His father was the king. The idea of monarchy was restored. So monarchy was restored, or kingship was restored on this particular year when Charles II was crowned the king, and this was 1660, and the point is called the Restoration. And therefore, the Puritan age kind of comes to a halt with the Restoration. But there are examples in literature, even after Restoration, where we see Puritan ethos. Because Puritanism is not technically a political ideal, it's a religious ideal. So it is not completely dependent on political events, although it is integrally connected to it. So we can say that the Restoration set a different kind of spirit for the people to look forward to. Now the people who were tired and frustrated with the kind of dark and gloomy regime, they welcomed Charles II for his charming personality and looked forward to a rule of light, a rule of freedom, because ironically, the Puritan Parliament, which actually started professing about freedom, were actually against it. So the same kind of people who had supported the Parliament because they supported freedom were now supporting Charles II, because Charles II represented for them the kind of freedom they wanted, the freedom to enjoy life. Now, unlike in other videos, I have spent quite a lot of time on the historical backdrop because it is very important to understand these changes that brought about the restoration, to understand the man who is the focus of today's video, John Milton. Milton was born in 1608 in London. He was born in a rich family. His father, he had interest in music. Milton was brought up like a privileged child. He went to a good school, St. Paul's School, and eventually to Christ College in Cambridge at a very young age. His life, his literary life, is divided into three parts. The early period of poetry, the middle period, which focused mainly on prose writings and pamphlets, and the third and the magnificent period when he wrote his best works. So let's first look at the first period, that is his formative years. Now, while he stayed at Cambridge, he wrote a lot of poems. And the first complete English poem that we have is something which he wrote when he was 21 years of age. And that is known as the Nativity Ode. The full title is The Hymn on the Morning of Christ's Nativity. Nativity means birthday. In other words, Christmas poem. The major influence on him during this time was, of course, Spenser. If you are an English poet, you cannot avoid Spenser. Spenser is known as the poet's poet. That means if you are a poet, then Spenser is your guide. Okay, so he was influenced by Spenser. He studied meticulously. Even after his college, he went for independent study at home for years. And what did he study? Well, what not? He studied Greek and Roman literature, that is the classics, theology, even in Hebrew, ancient and medieval history, moral and political philosophy, natural sciences, the Italian language, and of course, English poetry and drama was definitely a part of his study. So he absorbed knowledge like a sponge with this insatiable thirst. And then he thought that this is not enough. I need more. Of the poems that he wrote during this period, Comus, which is actually a masque, is very famous. And in Comus, we see he talks about this conflict and this figure of Satan looming large in his idea. This was the time from when he had started to think about the theme which he would write on, the theme that he could transform into an epic. And somehow he felt that the knowledge which he was gaining at home must be expanded, and he went to Italy to study more. I would also like to mention elegies like Lycidas, which he published with some other elegy, a collection of elegies, many in Latin. And this elegy was written on Edward King, a student of Christ College. This was also a time when he wrote numerous sonnets and poems, not just in English, but in different languages. So this was like a preparation stage for him. By the time he returned to England in around 1639, the conflict between the king and parliament, that had gained a lot of momentum. He had actually returned from Italy thinking that he must return home while this was going on, because he wanted to be a part of this epic moment. He thought that he must be present when such a momentous thing was happening, such a clash was happening back home. He couldn't stay abroad in the safety of a foreign land. It was in 1640 that he joined the mainstream political arena, and it was during that long parliament thing was happening. How did he participate in politics? Well, by writing, of course. And he started to write pamphlets and treatises, like these short essays, you can say, which advertised a cause. It was like those WhatsApp messages you receive in support of a political party, that is a pamphlet. So yes, of course, that was like, you can feel that that's like of a demotion. You are writing a Spenserian poem, and then you start writing a political treatise that appears to be like a degradation. But in Milton's eyes, it was not a degradation. It was like he was fighting for a cause, for an immediate cause. And that gave him the kind of enthusiasm which kept him away from poetry for such a huge stretch of time during his middle literary period. For the next 20 years, there was no poetry, only political writings. His first pamphlet was Of Reformation Touching Church Discipline. So from the title itself, you can understand that he's talking about church and discipline and government. So he's totally involved in this Puritan cause. And he was a staunch supporter of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell admired Milton because of his literary and intellectual power, and he gave a very important position to Milton in his court. And on one hand, his work was to support the Puritan regime, especially defending the execution of Charles, because, of course, when a king is killed, many people were not happy about the whole thing. They might have felt that, okay, it was not right to kill a king. Milton knew that he could convince people with his language, because language is the greatest equivocator, you can say. And he was able to successfully convince a lot of people on the justification of killing the king. This was his job. And the other thing that he did was he used his multiple language skills to go on diplomatic missions and negotiate with foreign countries, because Oliver Cromwell trusted Milton a lot. And therefore, when Cromwell's rule ended, Milton was a target of the royalists because he had been so much against the royalists in his lifetime. So Milton acted like a PR, a public relations officer for Oliver Cromwell, and he did that because he believed in those things. He went on writing pamphlets, pamphlets like Defense of the English People, The Second Defense, Defense of Himself, and there were several others, a long list rather. So far as personal life was concerned, in 1642, he was married to a woman called Mary Powell, who was, incidentally, a Roman Catholic. Now, several months after their marriage, he went to her father's house and didn't come back. Milton had hoped for a relationship, an intellectual companionship, which he never found in his wife. He wanted a way out. But then, within this Catholic system of belief, you cannot get a divorce. If you're married for life and eternity and so on. Milton wanted a way out so bad that he actually wrote pamphlets on divorce. In 1643, he wrote The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce and several other such treatises. And of course, his pamphlets which were published, or his works which were published, brought about a lot of controversy too, because it hit the belief system of many people. Now, during this time, the censor board was already set up. This was during the rule of Charles I. Now, this censor board, they saw that this kind of work, advocating divorce, is published. So they go against the person who printed, and there's a lot of controversy, and Milton is enraged, and he feels that independence of the press, freedom of the press is threatened by the censor board, and he writes another treatise, that is Areopagitica, which is against these kinds of tendencies which block the freedom of press. So you see, one pamphlet led to another pamphlet. And then he also wrote treatise of education. He believed that all these writings, they were related to each other. He was talking about the different aspects of the domestic life. So these kinds of controversial thoughts were very much there in Milton. So you cannot dismiss him as a Puritan man who was old-fashioned and conservative. He was not. He felt the conflicts of his age and he responded in the best way he could. And sometimes his pamphlets were, or his treatises were, against each other. It was like he was having a conversation with himself. And there's a lot of variety of themes. With the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658, there's a pause. He stops writing. Now, by 1655, his blindness had started to develop and he was losing his sight. With the restoration, all his political hopes ended. He did publish works in support of Commonwealth after that, but he knew that it wouldn't be possible to turn the nation around anymore again. So there was a kind of disillusionment, a kind of rethinking in him. See, you have belief in an ideal. It is one thing if you believe in something which doesn't happen in your lifetime. But what if that belief, that ideal, becomes real in your lifetime and you see the skeletons in it, you see the mud marks in it, and then you realize that this ideal, this dream I had been chasing is ultimately nothing, no different. It's not the ideal world. Then you become disillusioned. Then you start to question your own earlier ideal, your own earlier motivation. And this conflicted Milton, this disillusioned Milton, this Milton who questions not just his blindness, but the very purpose of life of a blind man, this Milton is the Milton who wrote Paradise Lost. Not when he was in the peak of his political glory, but rather when he was practically in hiding. Now, because I have made this full-fledged series on Paradise Lost, I will not spend much time here in this video talking about this text. But I want you to just know one thing, that the central theme of Paradise Lost is justifying the ways of God to men. It is the story of the fall of man. It's the story of Adam and Eve, how Eve got the forbidden fruit, how Satan persuaded her, how Adam chose to stay with Eve, and how they somehow stuck together even when the ultimate crisis fell. The idea of a national epic was there in Milton since he was in his college days. And during this time, Fairy Queen, Spenser's Fairy Queen, and the Arthurian legend, this was the only idea of national epic that there was, because British history had no provision for any larger theme. So even in his early days, Milton had thought that he would not confine himself to any national epic, but rather something that will go beyond nations. For him, the story of the Bible was the most universal story possible, because this story was something that was close to his own Puritan idea, and he felt that there were many things in the Bible which he wanted to talk about. First, he had decided to write a drama, and he had this name in his mind, Adam Unparadised. But his approach was too subjective, and you need a kind of objectivity for drama. And somehow he felt that if he is going to write a drama, Adam Unparadised, the focus would be on Adam. But he wanted an epic structure with more than one focal points. And therefore we have this struggle of not just men, but of angels. We have this epic where he shows us not just the loss of Eden, but the loss of heaven as well. And after Paradise Lost was published, one of his friends said, what about gaining it back? What about Paradise Found? And then he wrote Paradise Regained. Paradise Regained was much shorter in length. It was about the temptation of Christ by Satan. And he somehow was obsessed with the idea of gaining the paradise within oneself. Was Milton of the devil's party? Many people ask that. We don't know that. What I have felt reading Paradise Lost is that this was the question which Milton was asking himself. Am I of the devil's party? Paradise Lost is not an answer to this question. Paradise Lost is this question. And with Paradise Regained, he published another book. This one may be called The Only truly Greek tragedy in English, that is Samson Agonistes. This is not the story of some Christian hero, but although the structure is so very Greek, following all the conventions of Aristotelian prescriptions of Greek tragedy, but still the core is essentially Christian. It's about the concept of a fallen hero, a subtle kind of heroism, not physical heroism, but a kind of moral strength that Samson represents. He had asked a question in Paradise Lost. He had asked whether God's ways are justified or not. In Samson, he replies himself, just are the ways of God and justifiable to men. Samson's journey is a journey from darkness. He is a blind hero. His wife had betrayed him, taken away his strength, and how he gains control of himself, how he eventually manages to bring down the Philistines, and at the same time, how the end of the story or the end of the play brings about the calm of mind, all passion spent, the idea of catharsis. It was as if he was trying to justify his purpose, trying to say that despite being a blind man, I can still create history. And very, very rarely do we find such intimate, almost autobiographical connection between the playwright and the hero or the protagonist within the framework of a Greek tragedy. For Milton, the personal was the universal. Because for Milton, he was as much Adam as he was Satan. He was as much Samson as he was Christ. And all his life, he had tried to justify God's ways, God's rewards, and God's punishments. It is not easy to brand him just as a Puritan. He was a child of the Renaissance and the Reformation. He was the melting pot of so many things. And very much like Chaucer, he deserves an entire age to be named after him. Who were his contemporaries? What else was being written during his time? Well, for starters, we have talked about the Caroline poets, the metaphysical poets, when we were talking about poetry during and after the Renaissance. The link is there in the I button. I will also give the link in the description box. I have discussed at length on the kind of drama that was being written during this time. So I will focus rather on some of the prose writers during the Puritan age. And before anybody else, I would like to talk about John Bunyan, because right after Milton's death, Bunyan's book, The Pilgrim's Progress, that was published. And this book kind of offers a kind of closure, you can say, to this whole idea that this age represents. In John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, the writer, he uses two forms. One, the form of the allegory or fable, and second, the form of the dream vision. Now, if you remember about these conventions, dream poems and allegories, these were pre-Renaissance forms. These forms existed in English literature before the Renaissance. The Renaissance represents a kind of fascination with the idea of transience, nothing lasts forever, life is not permanent, and therefore act now. The idea of carpe diem, okay, do it now, seize the moment, make your choices, stick to them. That's the kind of idea that Renaissance represents, and this is best reflected in the theaters of Renaissance. But the pre-Renaissance idea, the faith in the structure of heaven, hell, okay, the idea of God, that is restored in Bunyan's narrative, because the idea of morality as being more important than the idea of artistic expression, that is the central idea, central sentiment of the Puritan age. And this is best reflected in Bunyan's work. Among the important prose writers, it is customary to mention names such as Robert Burton, Sir Thomas Browne, Thomas Fuller, Jeremy Taylor, and a couple more people. Now, Robert Burton, he wrote this book, Anatomy of Melancholy, which was basically shaped in the form of a medical treatise on morbidity or this idea of melancholy, but it ended up being a collection of classical quotations and references. It is considered to be an important work because of so many intertextual references that he uses. So it kind of moves beyond its actual scope. Thomas Browne, he was a physician, and he wrote on this very interesting subject, the religion of a doctor, Religio Medici. Why is this very important? Because you see, this was the beginning point of the scientific revolution age also, and a physician, he represents all that is scientific. He has to have understanding of the laws of physics, of the laws of biology, of the laws of natural sciences. But placed within this Puritan regime, how would a physician respond to these things? And then there are questions where a doctor does not have answers. So all these philosophical aspects are brought in beautifully in Thomas Browne's book. He also wrote a couple of more books like Vulgar Errors and Urn Burial. In fact, Urn Burial has more literary merit, although Religio Medici is a more famous work and is more popular. Fuller, he was a Caroline poet, and he also wrote a number of prose works. Jeremy Taylor, the man I had mentioned, he was a clergyman, and despite being a clergyman, he wrote on the concept of religious tolerance. In many of his works, we find that idea. He had this book on, book on holy living and then holy dying. Sometimes they are published as a combined volume. In Walton, we find a lot of biographies, mostly on literary figures. And interestingly, he wrote a book on fishing, The Complete Angler. Now, from these prose writers, what we gather is that there is a lot of somber and serious content that were being developed. The tone is usually meditative, intellectual. Even in poetry, we see this, metaphysical poetry flourishing with a lot of emphasis on intellect and weight rather than on passion and sentiments. So what we see here is there was definitely a response against the Renaissance, a response against this spontaneous overflow, and at the same time, they were influenced by these Renaissance thinkers too. This century had seen the kind of effect which the questions raised during Renaissance have. During the Renaissance, people raised questions, and as a result of that, what happens? The chaos of an executed king, dissolution of a known society, disruption of family, and that brought about the kind of melancholy that gripped the whole century. What happens after this? How the Restoration actually changes things? Well, you'll have to wait till the next video for that, because we will be taking up Restoration literature, focusing on Restoration tragedies and comedies, and also we'll be talking about other kinds of works that were written during the Restoration period and how that was diametrically opposite to the literature produced during the Puritan age. So thank you for staying with me in this video. I really hope to see you all in my next video. Do like, share and subscribe and keep commenting, because that encourages us a lot. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. I'll be catching you up soon. Till then, this is nibblepop. Bye bye.